You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show with simple, practical, and fun ideas to help you grow food at home, whether it's on a balcony, in a backyard, or bigger. I'm your host, Stephen Biggs. Welcome to the Food Garden Life Show, Season 9, Episode 21. Most food plants are sent to the vegetable patch, while the ornamental border is expected to sit there and look respectable. But my guest today sees no good reason for that strict garden zoning. Harry Holding is an award-winning UK garden designer and the author of Eat Your Garden, Edimentals as a beautiful, low-effort way to grow food. Edimentals are plants that are both edible and ornamental. They can give us food, add color, texture, structure, and habitat to the garden. Harry and I talk about creating gardens that invite us to forage and graze, designing edible plants in layers, making the most of small spaces, and questioning some of the rules gardeners have inherited. We also get into a wonderfully unexpected plant list, including sea kale, sochan, Korean aster, hostas, and even lamb's ear. So let's move the food beyond the veggie patch and eat the rest of the garden. Now, here's my chat with Harry. Hey, Harry, welcome to the Food Garden Life Show.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be on here.
I'm really excited to talk today about moving food gardening out of the veggie patch because your new book, Eat Your Garden, is brilliant. So maybe we could just start with a term that you use a lot in the book that I love. You talk about the term edimentals. Can you introduce that term to people?
Absolutely, yeah. And quite rightly, I do use that term a lot in the book. And the idea with the word edimentals is that it means edible ornamental plants. And I cannot take the credit for coming up with it. It was coined by Stephen Barstow, who is an amazing horticulturalist and really experimental food grower out in Norway. He's a British born and also known as the extreme salad man because I think he has the world Guinness World Record for the most diverse salad with over 500 different plants going into it. And ultimately, for me, edimentals just represent such an amazing umbrella term for a group of plants that are, yes, just simply both beautiful and delicious. And they bring so many different benefits beyond that as well. Majority of them are perennial, um, great benefits for biodiversity and pollinators, often have inbuilt climate resilience to them, so deeper roots that can help with some of the kind of extremes of weather that we're getting, and of course things like soil erosion, protection of soil, carbon sequestration, and so many different benefits that just for me it makes complete sense to be bringing them into our gardens, whether you're a keen, avid annual vegetable grower or you're just a ornamental gardener who is excited about bringing some edible plants into their space.
We should talk too about your work and just introduce listeners to your work because you don't just design gardens for people, but you do some fabulous show gardens that really inspire people. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, my design studio is based in the UK, but we work internationally, and everything from residential gardens to commercial developments and charities and botanic gardens. So a real breadth of work, which I find keeps me constantly learning and really is exciting. So I think I got into edimentals and food growing for many reasons, and that journey sort of culminated in 2023 when we did our first show garden at the RHS Chelsea Flower Show, and we did a garden with the charity School Food Matters, and over 80% of the planting was edible. And what really just struck me was how people reacted to the space, because of course in the UK we're a country of gardeners, and a lot of food growing happens as well, and people love it. And seeing a space that looked, very beautiful, you'll see it on the front cover of the book, and we cover it a lot throughout the book. but also over 80% of the plants were edible, and it was things that people either had in their garden already, or they just never even knew were edible. And some classic things as well, like artichokes and asparagus and fennel and all the different herbs that you might consider. But then also unusual things like Sphodoline lutea, which is called king spear, and it's an amazing plant I see growing when I'm hiking out in Greece over these drought-laden mountain ranges, and they're just delicious. When they come up in spring, you get amazing stems. The roots are really wonderful, kind of nutty flavor to them. They were prized by ancient Greeks, and the flowers are delicious, zingy kind of pop to a salad. There are these amazing spikes with yellow flowers on them. So, lots of fun, unusual things as well. And we then won the People's Choice Award, which was, really incredible and just showed to me that this was something people wanted to learn more about. So, hence it set the journey of writing the book Eat Your Garden.
Amazing. So a garden with over 80% edibles, and it sounds like this plant palette was very diverse, a mix of well-known and the lesser known.
Yeah, and it's also about creating that sort of foraging like experience. I think that we're really losing connection with nature. Of course, I'm sure your listeners are absolutely avid gardeners and nature lovers, but as a society as a whole, it's no surprise, and the more technological the world becomes, the greater that disconnection seems to be growing. So ultimately, I think a foraging like experience to going out and harvesting food is bringing us so close to our roots as hunter gatherers, and to that kind of innate desire in us to kind of be out in nature, collecting and harvesting food, and then bringing it into the home. So I think that's something that has been really evolving for me. The idea originally just exciting because you can grow low input food that is beautiful. That sounds wonderful. I mean, I'm sure all of us want that. And I was someone struggling to toil away at an allotment, which is a what you I think would call a community garden plot, and just really lacking the time running a business, and as we all have busy lives. So it was just something that really drove me down that path. But I think what's kind of evolved in my mind is actually how powerful food is as a gateway to nature connection, and this style of growing really just brings it that much closer to a natural ecosystem as opposed to the more regimented and orderly annual vegetable system, which I have to say I love still, and I am a grower of traditional vegetables, so it's not a either or. I think you can have both, and whatever suits your lifestyle and your your sort of time and your space and your desires, really.
I love that, foraging, a foraging garden. I sometimes use the term grazing when I talk about my garden, and I suppose that's very similar or maybe the same.
Exactly. That's the thing. I mean, little and often is a really great way to approach edimentals because they'll be giving year round, even in that sort of hungry gap. But you're rarely going to get the gluts that you get of traditional annual vegetables, which has pros and cons, of course. And but I think it just is a wonderful way to bring that sort of steady, edible, and diverse palette through. And of course, that diversity is not just great for the garden and the biodiversity and the wildlife that exists there, but also great for your gut and feeding that sort of microbiome. So yeah, the benefits really are far and wide.
I wanted to ask you about design and the idea of combining aesthetics with food, because sometimes people think that they're mutually exclusive and a food garden can't be beautiful. So maybe could you walk us through design and things like layers and color and texture? What do you teach about those?
Absolutely. Well, it's we could probably do a whole series just on it. So I'll try and be succinct. And I do walk through step by step my design process, which is rooted in ecological principles that basically brings our planting and our gardens closer to how natural systems work, and ultimately that creates something that's much lower in management, less intensive, and also is more evocative of a natural environment. And I think for me, the idea of bringing food and beauty together is just something that I've always done, literally since a child, because I had two grandmothers who were really into gardening. And on one side, she absolutely loved ornamental gardens. That was it. The garden had to be there for flowers and ornamental plants. And it was an old farm that the new housing development had been built on. So she was constantly, and she's still living there today, constantly battling to remove this asparagus that keeps coming back. So that was one side on one extreme, and then the other extreme was a grandmother who, turned the entire garden into a growing spot, so an allotment or community plot style. And for her, it was all about utility. So when I got my first little slice of my parents' garden, they said I could do what I wanted, probably around 6 or 7 years old. I naturally brought those two influences together, and I don't think there's any photos that exist of what that looked like, but that the idea of food and beauty was just sort of made sense to me, and you weren't held back by, I guess, societal norms. But ultimately, I think the key thing with planting design is having a process. And the first thing for me is starting with that romantic idea and the artistic vision of what you want to create, and holding that really true to what you do. And then it's about really creating a layered system, and the layers will depend on what style of planting you're creating. But let's just look at a standard perennial type of system, like a meadow or prairie style of planting, where you would have some structural and emergent plants, and these form the kind of bones of the garden. They're planting, and they give it legibility. And you don't want much of that, a small percentage, say 10, 15%, and that just allows your eye to kind of wander through the space. And these are plants that might hold the space, something like an artichoke. That's very statuesque, very large, architectural. It works as a standalone species, planted as a one or a two or a three. And then as you move through to the next layer, it's the kind of seasonal hits, as I call them, or the mid layer. And that might make up about 30 or 40% of your planting. And it's bringing the main visual impression at any one moment. So it will be the color waves, the texture waves. Start with spring, winter bulbs into early summer, late spring flowering perennials, midsummer, and then into late summer, early autumn. And through that, there's so many different plants you can layer into it. And they're really just knitting that mid layer together and bringing you a kind of great amount of joy and visual interest. And then the lower layer, the kind of low or ground cover, ultimately that is, you know, about 50 or so percent, 40, 50%. It's not plants that are vying for that much attention, fairly nondescript a lot of the time. You don't want them to be too attention grabbing, but it's bringing you a core ecological function of knitting together the planting, allowing there to be a constant soil cover and avoid weed ingress. And here we use a lot of grasses, which very few grasses are edible. I mean, something like the foxtail barley, Bordeaux jubatum, you could, turn into sort of flour and do something with it. But most aren't. But they perform a great ecological function and create a matrix, as well as other really fun, um, beautiful plants that can just creep around. And I mean, things like a wild strawberry or strawberries are a great one because they can take the shade of all the plants above them, and then of course give you that fruit earlier on in the year before everything else has got going. So it's really drawing that kind of layered approach on forest garden like principles. But I think it's distilling it down into that garden form. And I could go on and on, but I think that kind of covers the absolute core basis. And then there's a very sort of accessible step-by-step approach that I go through in my book that really allows someone who is a keen gardener or a kind of budding designer to walk through the point of having a bare patch of earth and getting to each stage, through long listing, short listing, to ending up with the quantity of plants that you need to plant out in the garden. And that was really important for me, is to try and make that process more accessible, because so many of us gardeners, it might be about finding what looks good at the nursery and buying it there, but actually a more considered approach can really reap the benefits of it.
So we've got layers, and in those layers, we're going for color and texture, and some of those layers are evolving through the season. If this sounds like a lot of effort to people, because that might be a daunting thing for people to process, what What would you tell people about making this into more of a low effort, but high impact gardening? And that's something that you talk about in the book. How would you explain that?
Yeah, and I think it can seem daunting because, as I say, if you're not designing day in day out, then of course, approaching a planting design, there's an infinite number of variations and possibilities, and that is overwhelming. And step number one in my process is basically to establish your constraints, and constraints are a wonderful thing. So let's think about constraints in as much as you might set a concept or the general kind of visual idea from colors or textures and heights. And then, of course, you have your environmental conditions, which are constraints in themselves. So, what's going to work in that soil, in your sunlight conditions, in the exposure levels? And that's good principles that all of us gardeners are working to and should be working to, the right plant in the right place. So, instantly, by doing those constraints, you can go from a choice of thousands and thousands of plants down to far, far fewer. Because if you say that I'm only going to be working with plants that are yellow, blue, and pink flowering, that cuts out all of the orange, all of the red, all of the kind of, acid greens or whatever it might be, that it just helps you to refine and stop it from being an overwhelming process. So I think once you have those constraints established, then ultimately, I think the low input thing really comes from being much more inclined, much more sort of nature way of thinking, so a more ecological foundation. And what I mean by that is when you think about nature, we're in a constant process of succession, going from bare ground through to woodland in the temperate zones. So the closer you can align with a more complex layered system, the further you are along and the less likely you're going to get weeds coming into that space. So taking a layered approach means that you do have that cover and those different kind of core ecological functions and those niches or niches, as you might say, are being filled, both above ground and below ground. Because when you have diversity above ground, plants like like I said earlier, like a strawberry that's sitting there, that then gets covered by plants like yarrow, which I love using in tea, which then get covered by, I don't know, like an asparagus growing up, or a taller plant like a fennel. All of those are going to have different rooting methods, or like Jerusalem artichokes, which you know other prairie plants that have incredibly deep rooting systems. So that above ground complexity brings below ground complexity, fills those environmental niches, and prevents other plants that you don't want in your planting from getting into that plant community. So I know that can all sound quite daunting and lots of technical terms, but ultimately breaking it down is just looking at how plants grow in nature and trying to simulate that much more closely.
And I really liked what you started out with, this concept of constraints, because that really narrows down what we're dealing with.
It's so important. It's absolutely critical, and it can be overwhelming to do plant design, even if you're an experienced designer. So I think it's you've got to start from that foundation.
Let's talk about small spaces because in a home garden setting, often we're dealing with small spaces. What do you tell people about growing an edible ornamental garden in a small space? What are some tips, some ideas?
Yeah, I think that's really where a lot of my inspiration has also grown from is the fact that so many of our clients in cities struggle with the concept of giving up space for food growing, even if they're quite keen themselves. It just feels like a sacrifice to a small space, which may well be, you know, like on view from the inside year round, and therefore you want it to be looking at its absolute best, and therefore they kind of favour that ornamental side of things, and that's where I think Edimentals really help because I just start sneaking them into clients' gardens, and or of course some of them are on board with it, but others you just sneak it in and kind of show them over time that actually you can interact with your garden in another way because it does have these wonderful edible plants in it. But I think ultimately with a small space, maximizing planting. So if you imagine that space to be all planted as a starting point, is how I think about the garden. like a small kind of courtyard garden or a suburban urban garden, and then just carve out your functional requirements. So the terraces that you require, maybe it's like your little bench spot for your morning coffee or your evening gin and tonic sunset spot, and the pathways that connect and circulation. And then what you're left with is a really heavily abundant space that has still got lots of planting to it. And within that, you take that layered approach. It means you can just jam pack in because ultimately what you're able to sort of see and harvest early on in the season is very different to later on. If you see our work, what a garden and planting in a small space might look like in June, it's completely transformed come September, October. And with that transformation becomes basically a whole nother wave and layer of edible plants that just comes in succession and sequence throughout the year. And other things is, if you're in a rental property, which a lot of people might be, is you can still grow food in containers. So, I give examples for all scales of someone in really inspiring in the UK growing amazing food and fruit and vegetables and crops and edimentals on a balcony, a tiny little balcony on a high-rise flat in Manchester in the north of the UK, as well as other container examples. So, bring in a quince tree, layer it underneath with some herbs like oregano or some trailing rosemary or, some thyme, things that are just going to be able to thrive in a sort of sunny spot. Or you could have smaller pots with things like hostas in, which in the UK they absolutely get demolished by slugs. So, put them in pots can help you to kind of manage that a little bit, and they're wonderful when they first come out into growth. They're just absolutely delicious. It's a plant that gets farmed in Japan, so it's something that we just grow just as an ornamental, but they really are delightful.
Some great ideas for small spaces. And I like that starting out with some of those functional needs, like that place for a gin and tonic. And then once you've mapped out those, you can build that landscape around those.
Yeah, it's absolutely essential because, again, otherwise, how do you start creating a garden? I think people can go one way or the other, and I think a plantaholic might not have enough space to sit and enjoy it, whereas someone else might end up just with so much paving and hard landscaping, and not only is that more expensive, but also it doesn't create the kind of atmosphere and leave you much room for the kind of edimentals.
Well, still talking about where to start and creating a space, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen people make as they're trying to incorporate more edibles into garden design? What are things maybe to avoid or to be aware of?
I mean, I try to explore mistakes by making them myself. So I'm just casting my mind across some of the many mistakes I've made over the years, and that's the great way, really, because ultimately, we learn by our errors often, and of course, more likely to learn from our errors and our successes. And I think that one thing is really that you don't need to do one or the other. Like it's a mistake to think that you have to be dogmatic about one style of food growing because there are so many different approaches out there. And I think really the best and most resilient food systems come from that diversity. So bringing together traditional vegetables and edimentals and woody materials like food forest style growing, permaculture principles, all these different ideas absolutely can coexist. Equally, on the other side, um, and something I've experimented a lot with is trying to integrate annual vegetables in amongst a sort of more layered perennial edimental system can often lead to the annuals not working and it being quite a lot of wasted time. So it's a case of overly competitive plants outcompeting for light and water and nutrients. Of course, annual vegetables are traditionally quite hungry. So that's something I refuse to not continue to try and experiment with, but it can definitely come with its woes. And I think trying to find a little clearing or creating a clearing in an edimental planting where you can grow something that is more light demanding or where you can give it more space and more care is a great way of doing that. Or if you're establishing a new garden, while you have space in between all the plants before they've really sown together, and knitted together, then in that first year you can get a quick kind of catch crop and have annuals growing in amongst. So that's some success I've had with that. And I think another mistake is, it's just something slightly programmed in a lot of us is sort of adhering to the rules. The rules are really there to be broken, and I think that, you know, in the UK we love, our amazing organisations like the RHS and various TV personality gardeners who tell us that it should be this way or that way. But for me, scrap the rule book. Of course, there are amazing, solid principles that we should be using when gardening, but don't be constrained like that. If you've got an idea, go for it. Or if you read about something and want to try something, don't be afraid. Just give it a go, because ultimately, gardens and plants are forgiving, and you'll learn something along the way, and you're rarely going to do much damage. And that's a really enjoyable process.
I like that. Question the rules. Nice, nice.
Absolutely.
We should talk about a few of your favorite plants too. And I mean, your plant palette will be different from mine here in Toronto, but I'm sure there's some overlap. And I'd love to hear some of the top plants that you get excited telling people about.
I mean, it's so hard to kind of nail down your favorite plants, but I really do sort of mention hundreds of them in the book, and I had to narrow it down to do plant profiles on about 40 or so of them, and I break it down by the different layers. So some of my favorite that I come across, that I'm going to just kind of showcase, but they're certainly not by any means a kind of limited palette. There's a huge world of edimentals out there, and Stephen Barstow alone has grown over 3,000 of them in his garden in Norway, which is incredible. But Amelanchier alnifolia, so the Saskatoon. So we
Mm.
use Amelanchiers a lot in gardens, and the kind of North American Saskatoon is, got the most delicious berries of all the Amelanchiers. So that's wonderful, as well as sea buckthorn. I think you called it a sunchoke or sunberry, maybe a hip.
Sea
Um,
buckthorn is in use here too.
yeah, sea berries, I think you might call them. And is in America, perhaps in the United States. Um, Absolutely incredible, delicious, so much vitamin C as well. They're really kind of one of those superfoods. Sea kale, which is something we grow a lot of here in the UK. It used to be, it nearly got foraged to extinction by the Victorians. So you see it growing all over our beaches, and is a wonderful, very drought tolerant plant that grows in the shingle and is a kale-like plant, but has a kind of delicious salty light leaf, and not overly salty, but and has a kind of beautiful architectural form and flowers. Obviously, I've talked about things like fennels and all different herbs and artichokes, classic kind of perennial foods that we love. Um, but then also another fun American one is Rebecca lanciata, Soshan, I believe it's said, um, which is absolutely loved by indigenous communities historically, and really delicious leaves as it comes into foliage earlier on in the year. And then looking at some of those mid layers, I talked about yarrow, which I love using in tea, and kingspear, so Sphodoline lutea, which was that amazing spike that was prized by the ancient Greeks. But also things like Korean aster, so Delingera scabera, which is just wonderful and it gets used a lot in Korean cuisine. A little bit of miso, blanching it with soy sauce, it's delicious. Daylilies, amazing. I know that they're very much loved plant in North America, and Hemerocallis citrinia is one of my favorites. Amazing, quite natural feeling daylily, and you can use the flowers like a stir fry. You can stuff them, you can batter them and deep fry them. Um, so really wonderful. And even Stachys byzantia, so lamb's ear, was a plant that I really didn't know until I was writing the book was edible. And actually in Brazil they you take those fairy leaves and sort of put breadcrumbs and fry them, and they call it like kind of like a little fish. So they kind of almost treat it like a kind of fish patty sort of thing. Um, and then some low, kind of ground cover like plants. Chives are one of my favorites. So allium, schwenoprasum, just generally the allium family. So many incredible, delicious alliums. So I'll just that's a great starter plant for edimentals because and chives are obviously one that we know and love, but are wonderful in an ornamental garden as well. And then really fun things like I've talked about hostas. A lot of people don't know they're edible, and Silene vulgaris, so the bladder campion, absolutely delicious. Leaves are great in salads, and it's quite a common plant that we use again a lot ornamentally. So yeah, I could go on and on, but those are a few highlights that I think should work over in. Although Toronto, you do get those cold winters. I think a lot of those should still withstand.
Yeah. Wow, this is great. So there's some new things in there for me. The lamb's ears, I've never heard about that. And wonderful. You've given me ideas for my garden too.
Nice, nice.
Well, we've sure covered a lot. And as we before we wrap up, Harry, I was thinking it would be great if you could maybe give two or three tips, two or three starting points for people who are now excited about this idea of the edible garden, but aren't quite sure where to start. What would you say? Two or three little things that are a starting point to get going.
First of all, looking at your garden, and you don't need to have a blank slate or having just moved into a new home to be thinking, how do I take an edimental approach to my garden? Of course, you may have a border that you're not happy with or an area of the garden that you need to rework or redo. So, great. If you've got a blank slate, it can kind of make things easier in a way because you're really just starting afresh. And the book, like I say, is packed with heaps of examples and gives you the system and ideas of how to go approach that. But if you love your garden, then don't be afraid to just create some space and plant some edimentals into it. Because all you need to do is start introducing a few pockets of plants that are going to be edible, and it will just start you on your journey of seeing your ornamental borders in a new light. Get you out there, connecting with it in a different way that you might not have thought before, and might only be sort of in your mind as you would approach your traditional annuals. So that's sort of one really kind of critical thing. I think is just take an assessment of where you're at, where the opportunities lie, and just be bold with it. Don't be afraid to kind of make a bit of room. And then once you've got it going, ultimately, you'll hopefully get a bit of a bug and you'll be excited to get going and add more in. But also, first things first is I would audit the plants that you got in your garden. What are you growing that you could eat that you don't even know is edible? And there's an amazing website called Plants for a Future. So PFAF, and it's a UK website. Amazing people in the UK that are creating this database and doing a lot of experimental growing themselves. And it has edibility ratings for a lot of plants on there. So no doubt, a lot of the garden plants that you'll be growing in North America will be on there. And just take a look, see what you got, put it through that website, and read about what qualities you may already have in your ornamental borders that are edible. So that's a really fun approach of looking at what you've got there. And then finally, it sort of ties a lot of what we've been talking about together, really, is take a considered approach as to what planting you're putting into the garden and how you curate it. Because if you just want to fill a space because you want to fill a space, then sure, that will do the job. But what kind of textures of plants do you have around you? What's your kind of color palette looking like? And ultimately, like, how does it evolve through the year? Because we're creating spaces that not only are beautiful or work in one static moment, but there's a temporal element. So really, just try and be considered and take a more methodical approach to what you're going to be bringing in and how you're bringing together your plants. So thinking in that kind of layered way and thinking about what kind of multiple uses you might get from every plant that goes into the garden, whether it's edibility, pollinator friendly, um, companion style plants that are going to help other plants that you're growing thrive. And also, that just pure thing of like grow what brings you joy. And the way that you're going to know what brings you joy is obviously the plants you know about already, but just trying different things. Just trying those unusual ones that you might not have thought of, and it could just bring you so much joy. And if it doesn't, move on to the next. And ultimately, we got to have our garden as a space that just makes your heart sing when you go out into it. So um, yeah, it's an evolution. Don't be hard on yourself. We can be quite tough on ourselves as gardeners and veg growers. So just try and enjoy it, and don't take yourself and the process too seriously.
A place that makes your heart sing. What a beautiful way to wrap up this fascinating chat. And Harry, congratulations on your new book, Eat Your Garden. It's amazing. And thank you for all these shared ideas today.
Thank you so much for having me, and continuing that good work of what you're doing and spreading the word.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.